Sweet. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Andrew.
Hey, Bruce. This is me. I'm Andrew Shell. I'm the CTO of a local company called Pinpoint Software. I have a couple sites that I blog on. Uh, I founded the PHP group and have been a developer since 2003. Been using Homestead now for at least a year or two now. I've used Vagrant longer than that, but Homestead's been really great lately. So to get started, I was going to talk about what Homestead is in a broader scope. It's a way of managing your virtual machines. And so I thought before I dug in too deep as to the nitty gritty of it, I would explain what a virtual machine was for those who aren't familiar. Basically, you have your own computer. You have a laptop or desktop computer, and a virtual machine is just an emulated machine running on that computer. And it's really handy for quite a few reasons. Well, here's, I guess, a scope as to what you'd see with Homestead. You have VirtualBox typically as the actual machine, the virtual machine at the bottom layer. Then you use Vagrant, which is a tool for building and maintaining those virtual machines. And then Laravel Homestead is a prepackaged Vagrant box and provisioning scripts. So what this allows you to have is an isolated environment from your desktop, so you don't have to install MySQL and PHP and everything. Well, I guess you do technically have to have PHP if you want to run Laravel Homestead, but you don't have to run MySQL or Apache or Nginx or anything else like that. Everything is isolated within this environment. And ideally, it'll be a lot closer to what you're going to have in a hosted environment anyways, because it'll be running Ubuntu Linux and all of the latest software there. Especially if you're running on Windows, that could be tricky. Multiple environments, so you can actually set up multiple virtual machines, each one having its own configuration. You can tweak them, do whatever you need to with those. And then easy to destroy and rebuild. So you're experimenting with something and you really mess things up. You haven't just messed up your whole computer where you need to like reinstall your operating system. You can just destroy that machine and start from scratch. Before I get into like, most of the talk today will just be like a hands-on showing you how you go ahead and use it and things like that. But I wanted to touch bases just on a little bit of what the dependencies are before you actually get this up and running. So for starters is VirtualBox. Vagrant can use other virtual machine systems. So if you have a license for VMware or Parallels or something like that, there are ways of doing that, but sort of the default out of the box is VirtualBox. Vagrant then is the tool that is typically used by Homestead to manage the virtual machine, so you have to have that installed as well. PHP 5.6 is required. It uses a lot of different things to set up your virtual machine, things like that, so you'll have that configured.
Andrew,
Yeah,
is 5.6 a requirement of Homestead?
it seems like it, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, it supports 5, 6, or 7 greater. So, and then these are two that are basically plugins to Vagrant that I think are pretty important. They're not necessarily required, but they'll make your life a lot easier. The first one is Vagrant Hosts Updater. And so as you'll see when I get into working with Vagrant, you can set up quite a few virtual hosts within that single machine. And so to be able to automatically have this plugin update your hosts file so that you can just go to fancy domain names and not have to edit that file on your own is great. And then VB Guest makes sure that the VirtualBox Guest package is installed properly, the current version for your version of VirtualBox. So sometimes the box that comes from Homestead will have an older version on there. If you've recently updated VirtualBox yourself, then that'll make sure that that's up to date so that all of your shared folders and things like that continue to work properly.
Is that already installed on the Homestead box that you get?
Well, this is on your host machine.
Oh,
And so the Homestead stuff is what will be getting installed. Basically, it's the package that's being installed around Vagrant, and then the machine that's created from that. And so very quickly, I wanted to jump into the demo here so you can actually see what I'm talking about. Let's see. This is the main website for Laravel Homestead. It's just a part of the documentation of the Laravel documents. A lot of the steps that I'll be going through here today are already documented in here, and so I'll post a link to these things in my notes. But if you're having problems or if you have a special configuration that you're looking for, this is the place to start, because this is going to explain a lot of different things. So if you needed, for instance, to use a different virtual machine, this will talk about some of the hoops you have to jump to switch that around. So to start with, you actually have to get Homestead. So this is the Git repo. The easiest way is to just clone the repository, but if you don't have Git on your host machine, just go in here and download the latest release. So that's 5.3.2. So we'll go to the command line. And we'll go back there. So we'll want to make sure that we're not running off of master. We want to run off of a specific version that's noted as being stable. So 5.3.2. Okay. So now, if we look here, you'll see, if you're familiar with Vagrant at all, you'll see that there's a Vagrant file. This is what describes to Vagrant what kind of box you're creating. What's in here doesn't really matter a whole lot, because one of the things that's great about Homestead is that it sort of makes Vagrant a lot easier to use than it would be on its own. So the next step is you just run the init program. That initializes it, which sets up a few symlinks, but most importantly, sets up your Homestead YAML file. Okay. Can everybody see that? So a couple things in here are important. So the first thing, in this particular example, I have to set up a separate name for it because I already have a normal Homestead installation on this machine, and so there would be a conflict with the default name that's provided. So I'm just going to create one here. Okay. Couple things in here to note. The main things you're probably going to use here is going to be the sites and the databases section. Homestead sets up whatever databases are in this list in both MySQL and Postgres, and so depending on what you want to use, both of those will be available to you. And then this is the way to map what virtual hosts you want set up on the machine. So folders, right now it says that your local home folder /code is going to be mapped internally as to home Vagrant code inside of the machine. And then your Homestead app, which is what it just set up for default, is going to be pointing at that home Vagrant code Laravel public. In this case, just to be consistent with the way I like things, I'm going to lowercase that. And we will get that set up next. So it doesn't actually have to exist yet when you get things ready, but to get started, we just type Vagrant up. And the first time you run this, if you don't have the Laravel Homestead box already on your machine, it will download that from the internet for you. But I shouldn't have to do that today because I already have that on my machine. So it still takes a little bit of time. The first step here is importing the box, where you basically have a virtual machine image that Laravel has already set up. It goes through here with the Vagrant stuff to basically set up all of your different port forwarding. So for instance, you'll see here that the 3306 for MySQL is being ported to 2202. Because I had that VirtualBox Guest Editions plugin, it's checking and says, oh wait, they didn't match, so we need to update that.
Do you have to be in the Homestead directory to invoke Homestead?
Yes. They have on that documentation, there's some shell commands that you can write to basically create like a universal Homestead command that you can just say Homestead up and down, but it's basically just proxying into this folder anyways.
Okay, yeah, that would be good to know.
Yeah, because the Vagrant tool looks for the Vagrant file internally to know what it's doing.
So then all your projects would have to be in the Homestead directory if you wanted to use Homestead.
Nope, actually no. I'll go back and show that in just a second here.
Okay.
The only thing you really have to do in the Homestead directory is your Vagrant commands.
Can you share this?
All right. So Bruce, in this folders section, this is where it's mapping folders on your machine to folders inside of the Vagrant box. And so you'll see here it's looking at the ~/code folder by default to the code folder in the home directory of the Vagrant box.
Yeah.
And so by default, that's where they expect your different Vagrant projects to be, is to have the root inside of your code folder. So I'll be setting that up in a moment. Probably should have set it up first because I saw that there was an error here where it says unable to mount one of your folders. So I'm going to go up a level, make that. And then to make sure that that gets rehooked up, I'll do Vagrant reload, which is basically the way to reboot the Vagrant machine and make sure that it reconnects all of the shared folders that you need to.
So the way that I have it arranged currently is that the Homestead folder is within the folder that I'm directing the root folder, in other words. Right now I have code going to my root folder, and the Homestead folder is in the root.
Okay. I'd have to take a look at that to see exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, but hopefully showing what's going on here shouldn't be too complicated.
Well, the arrangement I have still, I still have to go to the Homestead directory in order to invoke.
Right.
What's the difference between reload and provision?
So they're very similar, but they're sort of separate steps. So when you do Vagrant up, for instance, it starts up the machine, and if it hasn't been provisioned, it provisions it. And so that runs all the scripts to make sure that MySQL is installed, that the configuration files are in the right spot. Reload is a higher level than that. It doesn't really deal with what's running on the machine at all. It just reboots the machine and then makes sure that the ports are forwarded properly and the shared folders are hooked up properly.
So if you add a new site to your YAML file, do you have to do a provision, or would a reload suffice there?
Reload is not necessary, but you would provision it.
Okay.
Because if you think about it, adding a new site isn't going to change the shared folders. I mean, I guess if you were going to, let's go here. If it was like in a completely separate folder, so the way that this would typically work is that we would go into the code folder and we would create a new project in there. And so all the sites you have here could be pointing to different things within that code folder. If you wanted to map an additional folder, like let's say you said, I want to load something that's in my var www folder. I want to map that to then in this case, I think you probably would have to do a reload and a provision. So I would do vagrant reload space dash dash provision, because that says on the reload, make sure you re-provision everything.
Why would you need to do the provision?
Well, provisioning is going to set up the internal thing. So I guess if you just did this, that wouldn't make any sense. But
It's going to restart Apache anyways. That's just a mapping. But provisioning is by running.
But provisioning is what's going to set up the virtual machines, or set up the virtual hosts rather. So when you run provision, so if we added another site here, you'd have to run provisioning to create the virtual host settings for this new site.app. Did that answer your question?
So provisioning reads this file.
Yes.
Okay, so just doing a reload won't
Won't update your virtual
this file.
hosts. Yes.
Okay.
So right now, if we go to homestead.yaml, we shouldn't see anything. Or homestead.app. Yep, no input file specified because we haven't created that project yet. If we go into, so then to go into your box, the easiest way is to run vagrant SSH, and this will automatically use your appropriate keys to get in. So now we're at the command line, and because we had mapped the code folder to the home directory, we can just go into code now. It comes with the Laravel application already globally installed, so we can do Laravel new. We'll call it Laravel because that's what it was looking for. And so this will create the application. You could also use the Composer package installer, whatever that command is to let Composer install the application. But this is a little bit easier. So right now, Composer is just updating all the dependencies. And because it's a new machine, nothing's cached locally, so it's downloading everything taking a little bit longer. Future installations shouldn't take quite as long because most of those packages will be cached locally. Any questions yet? Okay. Okay, looks like it's running at the end now.
It's putting Symphony, it's putting other frameworks out there.
Well, it's using components, Symfony components.
Oh, Symphony 2, that's right.
So you're installing Laravel on the virtual machine?
Mm-hmm. All right. So now if we go into the Laravel folder, you'll see that this is a normal Laravel installation. And if we go back to that Homestead folder, or URL, the Homestead app, we now have Laravel installed. Couple things to note then is we look at the .env file. Out of the box, just in this case, everything's the default, so that's fine. But here are your database credentials. And so with Homestead, the MySQL database internally has a username of Homestead and a password of secret. And then it's just going to be whatever database you want to use. So if we look back here at this Homestead YAML, I have one database created called Homestead. But I could create as many other ones here for different projects. And then when I reprovisioned it, it would create a new database in MySQL called new project that we would be able to log into, again with the Homestead secret username and password. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're using Laravel is to be aware whether or not you're inside or outside of the box. So right now we're inside the Vagrant box, but if we go create a new tab here, we see the same code because it's sharing a folder with our local box. So the reason you'd want to do this is, if we want to use Sublime Text or whatever, we can just run that. And we now have access to all of our files here with our normal editors that we want to use. Where this gets tricky sometimes is if you're doing database things. So right now we're outside of it. So some stuff will continue to work. So we can run artisan and say make auth. Generating the scaffolding is fine. But if we run artisan migrate, we're going to get an error because I don't have MySQL installed on my local machine. And that's what it's trying to connect to because it's running outside of the virtual machine. So for this, we do have to go back inside of Vagrant and make sure that we run artisan migrate internally. The next thing to look at is how to connect to the database. In this case, you want to see where it's connected to. So here, I thought before it said something. Oh, here we go. I see. So I must have my other virtual machine running already, because by default it would have been 33.060, but now it's doing 22.02 because that one already is in use. So if I open up SQL Pro or whatever sort of database tool you want to use, in this particular case, let's create a new one. Let's see here. Call that meetup. So we'll connect locally. Same username and password, Homestead, secret. We just want to make sure that the password or the port is whatever the forwarded port was. So now we connect here and we can see that we have that Homestead database in here. We had run the migration already, so we have the password resets, users, and migrations folder in here. So that makes it very easy to just sort of get up and running. Let's take a look here at my notes. Cool. So this is just an easy way to get access to your database. Let's close that. Going back to the command line, when you're done working on it, there's a couple things you can do. So normally with a box like this, you're probably going to keep it around for a long period of time because you're going to set up a bunch of sites, you're going to be in different states of development on there. But you probably don't always want this running on your machine, because if you're not doing development, you don't need to have the virtual machine running and taking up memory and things like this. So the easiest way to sort of stash it away for now is to do vagrant halt. That will shut down the machine, so it's not currently running in memory, but it's still on disk, so that when you then when you want to resume it, all you have to do then is do vagrant up, and it'll get it up and running again. And this script is smart, so that when you do the hosts updater, when you shut it down, it should remove the host names from your hosts file, so that in case there's any sort of collisions between multiple boxes that you're running, those won't get in the way. But that's pretty easy. So now you have that up and running. If you're completely done or you want to start from scratch, then you do vagrant destroy, and that'll ask if that's actually something you want to do. Yep. And so this will shut down the VM and then actually delete all the files and stuff, so it's no longer taking up space on your hard drive. So if you do VirtualBox, these are just the three that I have. This is my actual production Homestead one that I use for work all the time, so I can go ahead and shut that one down too. All right. So now I'm going to try setting up, let's actually just go back here. Vagrant up again. So now we are recreating that box. Hopefully it shouldn't take quite as long. Let's see here. One thing to keep in mind when you do a destroy, because it's destroying the virtual machine, it will destroy all of your databases. So when we start this up, you'll see that although the database that we had specified will be recreated, none of the tables will be in it. It'll just be an empty database. So it still has to go through a lot of the steps, because since it's a new box, it still has to update it to the current version. But we won't have to go through all the process of reinstalling Laravel, because we already have that in our code folder. So that's still there, so it'll just load that up. Now what's great about this is I use this for any kind of PHP project that I want to work on. It's not really specific to Laravel. Obviously it's going to have everything set up so that if you want to work with Laravel, it's all there. So Node.js is installed, as well as all the global commands that are necessary for that. So if you want to use Webpack and things like that to rebuild your CSS and things like that, that'll all be available. But then again, you still have to be inside the virtual machine for that to work, because that's not installed necessarily on your host machine. So while this is getting started, I was going to set up a new, let's see here. Let's set up a new site just to show how that works. Create a new database.
Have the same names or not?
No, I mean you're pretty much just pointing it at. So you could name your host to be whatever you want it to be called. So that's just gonna be what you type in the URL, and then this is whatever folder it points at. So this could be, like this is homestead.app, and this is pointing at a Laravel folder.
So you only link the databases with your actual application.
Yeah. And so, you could have multiple sites that point to the same database, for instance. You could have sites that don't use the database. It doesn't really matter. So now that that's there, it may have ran it automatically, but just to be on the safe side, we'll do Vagrant provision, like I was mentioning before. And what this will do is you don't have to reinstall, obviously, the whole box. It just runs through the shell scripts to make sure that the environment inside of the box is what it's supposed to be. So that runs pretty quick, and all of your sites should be set up. So now if we do Vagrant SSH again, and we go into the code folder, make dir testing, public, we can just get that set up. And now if we go into here, you'll see that that loads up just fine in the different folder. All right. So this is the way that I typically will use Homestead. It makes it very easy. You have one virtual machine, so it takes up as much space as it takes up, but it's running. Everything works. You can set up a lot of different sites on that. But you may want to set up something special for a specific project of yours. And so Laravel Homestead does support that option as well. So I will show that next. So let's just do, all right. So I'm going to create a new project here. So just say make dir okay. So this doesn't even have to be a full Laravel project. It can be anything that you want. And so all we have to do in this case is say composer require Laravel Homestead. And in this case, we'll give it the dev flag, because you don't need to install that on your production site. Okay, and then we run vendor bin homestead make, and this is basically running like that shell init script that we ran before. So now we'll see that there is some files in here. There's a Vagrant file as well as a Homestead YAML. And you'll see this is very similar to what we just had. If you're running this on multiple machines, and if you're going to be running multiple virtual machines at the same time, you might need to change your IP address here a little bit. So let's just do 15 so it doesn't collide with anything. We also have down here the name and host name. So you could name these things whatever you need to. This is going to be called new project.app, but you know, it's going to be smart enough to name it. So before I had to add the name because I would default it would have just used Homestead 7. But when you do it in this method, it creates that automatically with the name of your project. So there really isn't anything we need to do here. I just changed that IP address. And so if we go back here, Vagrant up,
What kind of changes would you have between just, because I've never used it this way, I've always just done it as a global machine. What would be some changes that you would do that would make this beneficial over just a generic one?
well, for me, what's been really great about this is that I do most of my development on a laptop, and so I would prefer not to have Apache or Nginx and MySQL running on my server all the time, or having to manually, start them and stop them. So that's part of it. The other big reason is if you need to have different environments. So if you want to have an application that is going to be using a newer version for something, because for instance, 2 of the applications that we have at my job are, have been built at, years apart. So the first one is still running on, I think 5.5, and the newer one is 5.6, but all of our new stuff that we're developing right now is all 7.1. And so this gives me the opportunity to have all of those running in parallel. So whichever environment I need is just the one that I boot up for that.
So are you doing like the 5.5 or 5.6 installs then manually, or is there a setting you can do to force that on install?
I actually have some notes here that I can go into that. There is not a built-in way of doing that with Homestead, but it's a virtual machine, and so it's pretty easy to just go in there and set that up.
Okay.
But you just have to remember to change that. So if you do a destroy and you rebuild it, you might have to reconfigure those pieces. It would be nice if they had that baked in there, but they don't.
Can you do it like your after script or anything like that? Or is it
Probably,
too
yeah.
intense for that?
No, I mean it's pretty easy stuff. So if you're familiar with Vagrant, you could easily add an additional script in there for yourself to just do those changes.
Okay.
Would those notes that you mentioned be on the website or
Yeah.
available?
Yeah, I'll upload these all. I'll post a link on the Meetup site. I'm also recording this, so we'll have a video of the whole thing as well. So now, there we go. So that's our new project here just set up. If it was a full Laravel app, you could do that as well, obviously, but anything that uses Composer just works out of the box. So couple things to note. What would be really convenient and awesome that unfortunately doesn't work is being able to just have this set up in your project when you set it up, so somebody could just go in your project, say Vagrant up, and now they would have a virtual machine running your app. The problem is that in the Homestead folder, or in the homestead.yaml file, they obviously have hard-coded paths to what's being mapped. So what you may want to do is, if you put this in there, just have instructions to say, okay, you have to change this path here to be where this is installed. Some people would have, instead of a homestead.yaml file, they would rename this homestead.yaml.dist or something like that. And as part of it, say copy homestead.yaml.dist over to just homestead.yaml, and then edit this string, and you should be ready to go. because then you can do Vagrant up and everybody could have their own development environment. Because there are, if you dig into the documentation, there's different ways that you can tweak this for additional things. So like Redis or something like that. Some packages like that, like Memcache and Redis, I think are available as part of the Homestead distribution. So if you wanted to use that and configure it in a special way, there's some options for that. Let me just make sure. Yeah, so that's that. So now the last part I'll talk about is just the PHP version. So let's actually change this to okay, so we see that we're currently running 713. SSH into that box. All you have to do is sudo apt-get install PHP, let's say 5.6 FPM. Oh, something's not working. Oh, I know. You have to run apt-get update first. Now we can install that. And then sudo vim, go under your Nginx, sites enabled, new project app, and then if we scroll down here, you'll see that it says that it's passing it to the PHP 7.1 socket. We'll change that to the 5.6 socket. Sudo service nginx restart. And now you'll see that we're running 5.6. So if you're using this just because you're not super tech savvy with the command line for, you know, server maintenance and things like that, this might be more than you want to handle. But there isn't anything in there that's particularly complicated to do that. Now, if you wanted to get a different version of MySQL running, that might be a little bit trickier. You'd have to look into that, but it's just a standard Ubuntu installation. So whatever you can do to make that happen should be pretty easy to do. I've also been able to install other software on here that doesn't come packaged with Homestead out of the box. So with my current project that I'm working on, we're using RabbitMQ, and so I was able to just install that on the box as well. And so that's really another benefit to this, if you're willing to, you know, roll up your sleeves a little bit, is that you know, you can try out all sorts of different things, different databases, different tools, things like that, without worrying about it like messing up your computer. And so you can try getting it up and running, and it's like, oh wait, this totally didn't work. Just, you know, wipe it out and start from scratch again and say, okay, well, let's try this again. But that is what I've prepared. So are there any questions or anything you'd like to see? Yeah.
Just, you know, you've been using it for a while, and what kinds of trouble can you get yourself into, I guess, like where you made a mess of this, and like what are some good things to keep in mind to fix it besides just blowing it away?
Yeah. The only times I've really run into any issues with Homestead specifically is when I've been trying to update it, and it's mostly because I hadn't done that very often. I had set up a new project with the latest version of Laravel, and when I was trying to do the NPM scripts and things like that, it wasn't working, and it was because I was running an older version of Homestead that didn't have a new enough version of Node and things like that. So it actually wasn't too bad after the fact, but let's do this vagrant. I'll go back to the main root. Okay. So a couple things in here. So there is the composer JSON. So if we look in here, you know, there might be some things that need to get updated in this place. Actually, let me just reference the website right away, because I think they say steps, because I think I tried to just update it with what I thought I needed to do and realized that it would have been easier if I just followed the instructions. Strange how that works. Yeah, so actually they don't even need to do all of that kind of stuff here. So it shows here just vagrant box update, pull the latest code down. So in this case, you know, it's saying pull origin master, but really if you just you know, do a git pull, and then you'll check out whatever the newest version of it is, and then composer update. And so this says if you've installed it via your projects one, you should ensure that composer JSON has the right version. So update your dependencies for that. But there are ways here it shows to use older boxes, but I think you'll run into problems pretty quick with that, because on Ubuntu, the package to run other versions of PHP changed not too long ago. So when you saw that OnDredge package that everything was being pulled out of, currently you can just do, you know, apt-get install PHP 7.1 dash whatever you want, and then like I said, the 5.6 is just the same thing, it's just whatever the version. Well, originally there was, you know, a 5.6 package in general. You would just install PHP FPM, and so it changed it globally. There wasn't those different namespaces, but then that got deprecated. And so if you go back a few versions of the box, it'll probably be trying to load that old one, which doesn't exist anymore, and so everything will just be completely broken. So that's why it's easier to just use the latest one and then install the older version of PHP manually. Because that's actually a little bit confusing, because if you Google like how to get the older versions of PHP on there, most of this blog post you'll read will tell you to just use an older box. But if you do enough digging, you'll see all the comments are like, hey, I tried to do that and it doesn't work. It's like, yeah, because things changed. So that's that part. Any other, did that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
So in a team environment, do you guys share VMs or try to replicate what you have like up in the cloud for production on your local machines? Or
So this is actually, so the project we're working on right now is the first one that we're actually building with Homestead. The previous two applications that we're running were still Vagrant virtual machines, but we had written our own sort of Puppet scripts for that. And part of the reason we switched to Homestead was because that was very painful. We ran into lots of issues because originally I built it with Ansible, and then we had a developer who wanted to use a Windows machine, and you couldn't run Ansible on the Windows machine, and it was just a lot of trouble getting it up and running. And so I found that if we just stuck with Homestead, especially since we're doing everything with the latest version of PHP anyways, that it made it very easy for all of us to have the same development environment. And then Right now, we're not doing anything special with that to replicate the same upstream. We essentially are, but we're doing that on a sort of a manual basis. I mean, we're using the same PPAs that have the PHP 7.1 in there. We're still using the latest LTS version of Ubuntu. So nothing there is super different, but we're not using the same scripts. However, if you stay in the Laravel ecosystem, I think it's called Forge. This is a way to create virtual machine, or to create virtual private servers in various VPSs built with basically this Laravel admin. And so my guess is that this is probably kept pretty much in sync with Homestead. And so if that was really important to you and you didn't want to have to mess around with it a lot on your own, you could probably just use Forge, and this would handle that for you. And then they have, let's see, was it Envoyer or something? Yeah, here we go. And then this is sort of that middle piece where it handles actually doing all the deploys for your site. And so if you're really into Laravel, I mean, all these things can work with other things without being a Laravel project. But obviously, if you're working on Laravel projects, this might be a really great way because everything here is designed to work out of the box with that. So,
Forge will deploy too.
does it?
Yeah, you can set up a push to deploy, and you can edit your deploy script on there. It's pretty, I mean, if you have some really big enterprise thing, Forge is probably better. But if you're just doing smaller stuff, then
Cool.
Forge, I mean, you can even just do it. You can have a branch, so you just just push that branch, it'll automatically.
Great. Yeah, I mean, we've been doing that kind of stuff, but our stuff is all sort of manual at this point. But yeah, we're just using webhooks and things like that from GitHub and GitLab. Any other questions?
Is there a way to use alternate databases?
Well, out of the box, it has MySQL and Postgres. If you want to use something, let me see
I thought I
here.
saw when you were scanning through there that they had something from Mongo in the instructions here.
Yeah, let me take a quick look here. So out of the box, this is what it comes with. Let's see. It's pretty small. So MariaDB, SQLite 3, Postgres Composer, Node, Redis, Memcache, Beanstalk, Mailhog, and ngrok. Let's see, Mongo. I'm not seeing anything here from MongoDB. You certainly could install it because it's just an Ubuntu box, so we can actually take a look at that pretty quick. Let's see here. So you would just follow these instructions. So obviously, if you're familiar with the command line, you'll get a lot more use out of the advanced features of this. But there we go. MongoDB is getting installed right now. Let's take a look what the next steps here are. Yeah, so taking a little bit of time. So it looks like it'll take a few more minutes, but
I have an unrelated question.
yeah, go for it.
No, I just forgot it. It'll come back to me.
Once you've got everything provisioned, you can run these completely offline, right?
Yes. Unless it's connecting to some sort of external service.
Okay, that's my question.
Yeah.
Do you use Brew or NPM for installing stuff on a Mac? Is there a fundamental difference or?
Brew or NPM?
Yeah.
Well, I use Brew for like normal Mac software. But, so for instance, I think you could probably could install Vagrant like through Brew. I'd have to see what I actually have through there. I'm not sure what I currently have installed through Brew, but a couple bigger application type things like that, I will. But I use NPM for just lots of projects because I write Node software as well. And so I'll still have Node global stuff if I'm using like Gulp or Grunt or something like that.
I haven't waded into all of the Brew docs, but I was just wondering what are the relevant benefits of using one over the other to install?
I think it's just what's available because there's going to be, they're coming from, Brew is a, Mac version of like apt-get kind of thing. So it has its own database of packaged software. Not everything that you can install through Brew, Homebrew is going to be available through NPM. There may be some overlap, but not 100% by any stretch. I think they're going to be pretty much two almost completely different sets of apps that can be installed. Because NPM is only going to really install apps that are written in JavaScript. So if the app isn't in JavaScript, it's not going to be on NPM. So if it's a Ruby app, like if you wanted to install Jekyll or something like that, you'd have to use Homebrew because that wouldn't be available in NPM. And even within that ecosystem, there's different stuff too. So, you can use NPM, which is going to install a lot of JavaScript, but a lot of people would also use Bower for client-side JavaScript. Although it seems like a lot of stuff is being moved into NPM because people just want to have one. But traditionally, if you want to install jQuery, you'd install jQuery with Bower. But you'd have like
It says not to use it anymore.
Bower doesn't want to use it anymore.
Bower says if you're doing a new project, don't use that.
Yeah. I've been using Webpack and Webpack uses NPM.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. And this is a good example of like why I like Vagrant and Homestead. Like I never would be doing this live if this was just on my main machine because I'd be too afraid of like messing something up while I'm installing Mongo. But this I don't care because if I mess something up, I can just wipe out the box.
So we hear a lot of stuff nowadays about containers and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
With Homestead, I personally have not had any issues with it. Like I've not run into any speed issues or anything like that. What are your opinions on one versus the other? Are they two different solutions or different problems kind of thing?
Yeah, to be honest, I have done pretty much nothing with Docker. So I have almost no experience with it whatsoever. I've tried a few little things here and there.
From what I understand, it's trying to solve the same problem,
Mhm.
just in a different, supposedly quicker way. But
Yeah, the idea is that instead of running a full virtual machine, it tries to wrap in sort of containers things that are then executed on your local stack. So it sort of is an alternate way of doing that, but I don't know exactly the mechanism by which that works.
okay.
I know that the compatibility, at least last time I heard, isn't like 100% cross-platform. So if you're running, a Linux machine, it's probably pretty easy to get something up with Docker. I think at this point, running it on a Mac is pretty easy. I don't know how easy it is on Windows. But anything that, VirtualBox and Vagrant can run on, you can get Homestead up and running with. So it's very cross-platform with that. But beyond that, I don't know a whole lot.
Okay.
Any other questions?
So would you use this over Valet because it's just kind of safer?
I started using this before I knew of Valet. But yes, I probably would still use this just because it's not polluting stuff on my local machine.
And it's more like your production Vagrant.
Right. Because I know that, Git will fix a lot of the problems with like line endings and stuff, but I know historically that's always been a pain in the butt if you're not working on a Linux box, and especially when I was on Windows, even just like paths and everything like this would be weird. But yeah, it's nice to just have a virtual machine that's ideally the same OS and everything that you're going to be running on production. Yeah, so it looks like MongoDB is running. It says it's loaded and active, so
Great, well.
it's doable.
Yeah, I did find a site that shows all of the instructions, but you demoed it, and it seemed really easy, so I'll plunge ahead with it later on.
Yeah.
Now get an Elasticsearch cluster going.
Okay. Maybe for another meetup. But yeah, that's certainly doable. We actually were going to be using Elasticsearch on a previous project, and we were able to set that up and running within Vagrant. So it's actually not too difficult. I think there's an apt-get package for it as well. You just kind of run it and it's
The Java
there.
part is the fun part.
Right. Great. Any other questions? Nope. All right.
Right.
Looks like you have a joined in
I do.
URL.
I have a joined in URL. Feedback is really important to speakers, so if you can take a minute, joined.in, that's join with a D at the end, no E, joined.in/talk/D as in Delta 47, A as in Alpha 3. So if anyone has a second, it's really easy. You don't have to create an account, but anonymous feedback doesn't count towards the speaker's rating. So you can leave anonymous feedback, but it is better if you could take a minute to sign in. It's better for the speaker that way. So if you have a minute, leave some feedback. And then don't forget about the conference. If anybody has any questions on the conference, come and talk to me. And come join us at All-Through. Like I said, it's right across the parking lot. You can see it when you leave the building here. So very close by. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks.